Aisha Reynolds woke up early on a crisp autumn morning, the kind of day that promised new beginnings and adventures. She had always loved mornings because they gave her a sense of possibility that anything could happen. She had a flight to catch later that afternoon to a new destination halfway across the world. But before that, there were a few errands to run in town. She grabbed her coffee mug and sipped it slowly as she glanced over her to-do list for the day and checked her social media notifications. She was still buzzing from the excitement of her latest blog post going viral and from the positive messages she had received from her followers all around the globe. Her phone was filled with comments, people asking for travel tips, sharing their stories, and even thanking her for her honesty and openness in her posts. They were stories from people who had experienced similar struggles to hers, and it made her feel connected to something much bigger than herself. It reminded her of the purpose she had found in her travels to bring light to the voices of the underrepresented, to open eyes to the beauty and challenges of different cultures, and to remind everyone that we were all more alike than we were different. She took a deep breath and set her phone aside, ready to take on the day. Aisha had always been an advocate for looking at the world through the lens of understanding and empathy. She believed that every experience had the potential to teach something new, and every person she met was an opportunity to learn more about the world, even if they were different from her. She had traveled to countless countries over the years, capturing moments from the streets of Paris to the markets of Morocco to the mountains of Peru. Each place, each encounter had shaped her into someone who valued patience, perspective, and kindness above all else. But that morning in the quiet suburban neighborhood was about to be a reminder that not everyone shared her outlook. It was a typical weekday, and Aisha was driving through the area in a bit of a rush. She wasn't running late, but she had just enough time to get her errands done before heading to the airport. It was the kind of day that felt like it would go smoothly, a day she would look back on as simple and uneventful. But as she passed through the intersection, her mind wandered to the details of her upcoming trip, and her foot pressed down slightly too hard on the accelerator without realizing it. The car's engine hummed as she sped up just a bit more than usual, but she didn't notice the speed limit sign on the side of the road. She wasn't even aware of how quickly she was going until a flash of blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Her heart skipped a beat for a moment, her mind racing with questions of what she could have possibly done wrong. She knew she hadn't run any red lights, and she hadn't been weaving in and out of lanes. But there they were, the flashing lights behind her. She quickly pulled over to the side of the road and rolled down her window. Her hands were steady, but there was a small knot in her stomach. The officer approached her with a stern look on his face as Aisha greeted him with a polite smile. He didn't return the greeting as he explained that she was speeding and that he would be issuing a fine. She tried to explain that she didn't realize she was going too fast and that she was just trying to make it through the intersection before the light changed. But he wasn't interested in her reasoning. He handed her the ticket without a second thought and walked away without saying another word. Aisha was left sitting in the car, feeling a mix of disbelief and frustration. She wasn't angry at the officer, but something about the entire situation didn't sit right with her. She felt as though she had been treated with impatience, as though she was just another faceless person in the system, someone who could be easily dismissed and judged for something as small as a momentary mistake. The following week, Aisha found herself standing in a small, sterile courtroom filled with the quiet murmur of people waiting for their cases to be heard. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, and the faint scent of old paper and coffee lingered in the air. She had been here before, but not often, and never for something like this. A minor traffic violation, a simple speeding ticket, was hardly something worth losing sleep over, but the encounter had left her unsettled. There was something about the way she had been treated that didn't sit well with her. She felt as if her explanation had been dismissed too easily, as if she was just another number in the system. As Aisha sat at the back of the courtroom waiting for her case to be called, she couldn't help but observe the other people around her. Most of them seemed to be in the same boat as her, ordinary citizens who had made small mistakes and were now facing the consequences of them. Aisha glanced over at the judge's bench, where Judge Leonard Harris sat. His nameplate was polished and gleamed under the bright fluorescent lights. He was an older man with a rigid posture and a calm but stern expression. He had the kind of face that suggested he had seen it all, or at least thought he had. He looked down at the case files before him, his glasses perched low on his nose as he prepared for the next hearing. When Aisha's name was called, she stood up and walked toward the front of the courtroom, trying to ignore the nervous flutter in her stomach. She wasn't afraid of the judge or the situation, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to be different. She had faced many challenges in her life, but this felt like one more hurdle in a system that didn't always seem fair. Judge Harris barely looked up as she approached. He was already flipping through papers on his desk. Without giving her much more than a cursory glance, Aisha introduced herself and explained briefly what had happened during the traffic stop. She tried to be calm and clear as she spoke, describing how she had accidentally sped up without realizing it and how she was simply trying to make it through the intersection before the light changed. She wasn't making excuses, but she wanted him to understand that it hadn't been intentional. The judge didn't seem particularly interested in her explanation. His eyes never left the papers in front of him, and his voice was curt as he asked her if she had any prior violations. She answered truthfully that she didn't, but his response was cold. He told her that the law was the law, and that her explanation didn't change the fact that she had broken it. He glanced down at her paperwork again, and in a matter-of-fact tone, informed her that she would be fined for the infraction. Aisha felt a sharp pang of disappointment. She had hoped for understanding, or at least a chance to explain herself more fully, but it seemed that the judge had already made up his mind. As he handed down the fine and dismissed her from the courtroom, she stood there for a moment, unable to move. The injustice of the situation hit her like a wave. She hadn't been given a fair chance to explain herself, to be heard beyond the facts on a piece of paper. She wasn't just a person in a car speeding through a neighborhood. She was a person with a story and a purpose, but none of that seemed to matter in the eyes of the law. All that mattered was that she had made a mistake, and that mistake would cost her money. She left the courtroom feeling deflated yet strangely determined to ensure that her voice would be heard this time. She walked out of the courthouse with the fine in hand, but with a new sense of resolve growing inside her. She wouldn't let this go, not because of the money, but because of the principle. It was time to speak up. As Aisha sat in her car, the fine resting on the passenger seat beside her, she stared ahead at the busy street. Her mind replayed the moments in court, how Judge Harris had barely listened to her, how her words had seemed to vanish into the sterile air of the courtroom, and how quickly the judge had dismissed her case. The frustration simmered beneath her calm exterior, but she pushed it down, focusing on what she could control. Aisha had learned long ago that anger, while justified, often clouded clarity. She wasn't going to let this incident define her. With a deep breath, she started the engine and drove away, her thoughts already shifting to how she would share her story with the world. Aisha had never been one to shy away from vulnerability, and as a travel blogger, her life was an open book. She had built her platform by sharing more than just the beautiful destinations she visited. Her posts were often about the challenges she faced, the prejudices she encountered, and the lessons learned from different cultures. She used her travels as a way to bridge divides, to encourage her followers to see the world with open hearts and open minds. Aisha had been blogging for years, ever since her first solo trip abroad had transformed her perspective on life. She had traveled to places where people didn't look like her, where the language was foreign, where the customs were unfamiliar. Each journey had reshaped her understanding of the world, and through her writing and photography, she aimed to reshape how others saw it too. She had amassed a large following, not just because of her beautiful photos or her captivating stories, but because she was real, genuine in a way that resonated with people. She didn't sugarcoat her experiences. She shared the highs and the lows. As she navigated through traffic on the way home, an idea began to form in her mind. Why not share this experience? Why not use this as another way to amplify the message she had been preaching all along? It wasn't just about the traffic ticket. It was about the underlying issue of judgment, of assumptions made based on superficial characteristics. The way she had been treated in court wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern that many people of color face daily, a pattern of being overlooked, dismissed, or judged by those in positions of power. Aisha knew her followers would understand. They were used to her honest storytelling, her ability to find meaning in the smallest moments. She would write about her experience in the courtroom, not just to vent her frustration, but to shed light on the biases that existed within the system. She wasn't looking to stir up anger. Rather, she wanted to spark a conversation, to show people that the justice system, like any other institution, was flawed and needed to be examined. When she got home, Aisha sat down at her desk and opened her laptop. She began typing, pouring her thoughts onto the screen. The words came easily, flowing from her heart. She wrote about the small interactions that had left a big impact, the dismissive attitude of the judge, the way her explanation had been disregarded, the assumption that she was just another traffic offender. She shared how, in that moment, she felt invisible, as if her story didn't matter. She ended the post with a call to action, to question not just the system, but our individual biases, to remind everyone that every person has a story and every person deserves to be heard. By the time she hit publish, Aisha knew that this post would do more than just vent her frustration. It would begin a conversation that was long overdue. The blog post went live later that afternoon, and Aisha leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen, waiting for the flood of responses. It didn't take long for the first few comments to roll in. At first, there were just a few words of support from her most dedicated followers. But soon, the post began to gain traction. It spread quickly across social media platforms, shared by thousands of people who resonated with Aisha's experience. Her followers, many of whom had followed her journey for years, appreciated her honesty and her willingness to speak out against something that wasn't just a personal inconvenience, but a much larger issue: systemic bias in the justice system. The comments came from all over the world. People from different races, cultures, and backgrounds shared their own stories of being judged by appearances or dismissed by authority figures. They talked about being overlooked, misjudged, or treated unfairly, simply because of their race, gender, or social status. Aisha felt a sense of solidarity in these messages. It was clear that her experience wasn't an isolated one, and the outpouring of support gave her a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just sharing her own story, she was opening up a space for others to share theirs. What struck her the most was how many people, including those who had never encountered bias themselves, took the time to comment in solidarity. They recognized that the issue wasn't just about her getting a traffic ticket. It was about how quickly assumptions were made, how easily people could be marginalized or overlooked based on their identity. The support was overwhelming, and within hours, Aisha's post had gone viral. News outlets began picking up on it, and her story made its way into the public eye. It wasn't just a traffic fine anymore. It was part of a larger conversation about race, bias, and the way the justice system often failed to recognize the complexities of individuals' lives. Aisha had always been vocal about social justice issues, but this felt different. This wasn't just an abstract issue she had written about on her blog. It was personal. The very system that was supposed to protect and serve had, in her eyes, failed her. She wasn't the only one to feel that way, and that was why the story was resonating so deeply with so many people. As the post continued to gain attention, Aisha realized that it was more than just the justice system that needed scrutiny. It was also the people within the system who were responsible for enforcing those laws. How often had they, like Judge Harris, made judgments without fully understanding the story of the people standing in front of them? How many times had they, knowingly or unknowingly, let their biases influence their decisions? Aisha wasn't calling for anyone to lose their job or face harsh consequences, but she was calling for a moment of reflection, a chance to consider the humanity behind every case. She had always believed in the power of empathy, in the idea that understanding and compassion could lead to positive change. In that moment, she decided that her next step wouldn't just be about raising awareness, it would be about fostering understanding. The comments and messages continued to pour in, but Aisha stayed focused on her next move. She knew that this wasn't the end of the conversation, it was just the beginning. The support she was receiving was more than she had ever anticipated, but it also made her realize the responsibility she had to continue this dialogue, not just through her blog, but through the relationships she'd built with others. If she could inspire even a fraction of the people who had reached out to her to take a moment to reflect on their own biases, then she would consider this a success. As the days passed, the viral post continued to stir up conversations both online and offline. Aisha had given her audience a voice, and they were using it in ways she hadn't imagined. As the days went on, Judge Leonard Harris found himself caught in an unexpected whirlwind. The case of Aisha Reynolds, a simple traffic violation, had turned into something far bigger than he had anticipated. At first, he hadn't thought much about the post circulating on social media. He was a seasoned judge, used to the daily grind of courtrooms and cases that often blended together in his mind. He had dismissed Aisha's case quickly, and for him, it was just another day at work. But as the days passed, he began to notice the growing buzz around it. His inbox was flooded with messages, and his name kept popping up on news sites and social media threads. He couldn't escape it. At first, Judge Harris was dismissive of the whole situation. It wasn't uncommon for people to vent online, especially in the face of a fine or a verdict they didn't agree with. But as more and more comments poured in, he began to pay closer attention. He saw the hashtags calling for more accountability, the stories from others who had felt marginalized or dismissed by the justice system. Some of the comments were direct and critical, questioning his approach to justice. Others were more thoughtful, encouraging him to reflect on how his decisions might impact those standing before him. Judge Harris couldn't ignore the weight of the feedback any longer. It was clear that Aisha's story had struck a nerve, and not just with her followers, but with people from all walks of life. As he sat in his office late one evening, he couldn't help but think about his own actions. He remembered the way he had dismissed Aisha in court, how quickly he had made a judgment without truly understanding her perspective. The more he thought about it, the more uncomfortable he felt. The comment sections, the social media threads, and even some of the articles that had been written made him realize something he hadn't fully considered. He had been part of the very system that so many were questioning. He wasn't blind to the fact that he had grown up with certain privileges, that his position of authority allowed him to make decisions that affected others in profound ways. He thought back to his many years on the bench, the countless cases he had presided over, and the assumptions that had undoubtedly influenced his rulings. He had always prided himself on being fair, but had he truly been as fair as he believed? Or had he, like so many others, been blinded by biases, subtle, unspoken, but deeply ingrained? As the realization began to settle in, Judge Harris knew he needed to take action. He couldn't simply ignore the growing conversation. It wasn't just Aisha's voice anymore. It was the collective voice of many people who felt unseen, unheard, and misunderstood. He felt compelled to make things right, not just for Aisha, but for himself and the system he represented. He couldn't change the past, but he could start with the present. The decision to reach out to Aisha wasn't easy. He had no idea how she would react. He had been the one to impose the fine, to dismiss her explanation, to treat her like another case file in a long list of names. But he knew he couldn't remain passive. He needed to apologize, not just for the fine, but for the way he had treated her as a person. More than that, he needed to take responsibility for the way the system had failed to recognize her humanity. He sat at his desk, drafting a letter that he hoped would convey his sincerity. He wasn't sure what kind of response he would get, but he knew he had to try. Aisha was sipping her morning coffee when she noticed the letter that had been slipped under her door. The envelope was simple, formal, and addressed to her in neat, professional handwriting. She raised an eyebrow, wondering who would send her something so official. It wasn't typical for her to receive letters like this. Her communication usually came in the form of emails, comments, or direct messages. Curiosity piqued, she opened the envelope carefully, pulling out a letter that, at first glance, seemed like just another formal correspondence. But as she began to read, her eyes widened in disbelief. It was a letter from Judge Leonard Harris. He began with an apology, not just for the fine she had received, but for the way she had been treated during her time in court. He acknowledged the social media storm that had followed her post and admitted that, in hindsight, he realized his approach had been far from empathetic. The letter was filled with an uncommon vulnerability from a man who had, up until that point, operated with a certain detachment from the people whose lives he affected. The judge admitted that while he had always prided himself on being fair, he hadn't considered how his actions might come across, especially in a system that many saw as unyielding and unjust. Aisha couldn't help but be taken aback. She had expected many things after her post went viral: more comments, more support, perhaps even some backlash from critics. But she had never imagined that Judge Harris, of all people, would reach out with such an honest and personal apology. He expressed regret for having made quick judgments based solely on the facts in front of him, without taking the time to understand the human side of the story. He admitted to his own biases, acknowledging that as a member of the justice system, he too had contributed to a culture that often overlooked the deeper context of people's lives. What struck Aisha the most was his acknowledgement of her voice. How her story had forced him to confront his own shortcomings, both as a judge and as a human being. As she read on, Judge Harris explained that he had taken steps to educate himself about the broader issues of racial bias and privilege. He was seeking ways to better engage with the people who came before him, to listen to their stories rather than simply judging them by the cold facts on paper. He ended the letter by saying that he wanted to make amends and would be donating a portion of his salary to a community organization that worked to promote racial equity in the justice system. Aisha was silent for a long moment after finishing the letter. She had been bracing for an impersonal response or worse, an outright dismissal of the concerns that had been raised by her post. But this letter, this unexpected and sincere apology, was something she hadn't anticipated. It was clear that Judge Harris had not just been listening to her words, but also the voices of countless others who had shared their stories in the wake of her post. She thought about the significance of what had just happened. It wasn't just an apology, it was an acknowledgement of the larger systemic issues that extended far beyond her case. For the first time, she felt that the issue she had raised had sparked a genuine moment of reflection from someone in power. This wasn't just about one judge changing his mind. It was about the potential for others in positions of authority to follow suit. Aisha knew she had to respond. This wasn't a moment to let slip away. She sat down at her desk and began drafting her reply, her fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. She thanked Judge Harris for his thoughtful letter, acknowledging the courage it had taken for him to reach out in such a way. She appreciated the honesty, but more importantly, she was hopeful that his actions would inspire others in the system to take a closer look at their own biases. She ended the letter with one simple thought: we all have the power to change, and it starts with the willingness to listen. A few days after sending her response to Judge Harris, Aisha received an unexpected follow-up. It wasn't another letter this time, but a phone call, a direct line to her. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if this was yet another media outlet asking for a statement. But then she recognized the number, and her pulse quickened. It was Judge Leonard Harris. "Hello, Aisha." His voice came through the line, warm but slightly hesitant. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I just wanted to personally thank you for your thoughtful response." Aisha took a deep breath. She hadn't expected him to call directly. She had thought the correspondence would remain formal, yet here he was on the other end of the line, sounding sincere and genuine. "Not at all, Judge Harris," she replied, her voice steady. "I was glad to hear from you. Your letter meant a lot." The judge paused for a moment, then continued. "I wanted to let you know that I've been reflecting deeply on what you said, and I'm planning to take further steps, not just to change how I approach cases, but how I view the people who stand before me. I want to make sure that my actions align with the values of fairness and empathy, and I realize I have a long way to go. I've already started taking part in some workshops on racial bias and systemic inequality in the justice system." Aisha listened intently, feeling a mixture of surprise and cautious optimism. "I think it's a great step, Judge. A lot of people can get defensive when confronted with their own biases, but you're acknowledging it and taking action. That's important. I appreciate you saying that," he said, "and I'd like to do more. I know this one apology isn't enough, but I want to show you that I'm serious about making a difference. It's not just about me. It's about the people we serve. We all need to be better. I hope to be a part of that change." Aisha felt a wave of emotion rise within her, both from the sincerity in his voice and from the realization that this was an important moment. A man in a position of power who had the authority to uphold the law was actively acknowledging the flaws within that system. It was rare to see such accountability, especially from someone who had been directly involved in the issue. "I'm really glad to hear that, Judge," she said quietly, her heart swelling with a sense of hope. "I think you've taken a big first step, and it's something that could inspire others to reflect as well. It's not about being perfect, but about being open to learning, growing, and listening." They spoke for a few more minutes, and the conversation naturally shifted toward the broader topic of how Aisha's blog had sparked a much-needed dialogue around systemic inequality. She told him about the messages she received from her followers, stories from people who had felt marginalized, overlooked, or unfairly treated by the justice system. The conversation had, in many ways, started to transcend just the issue of her traffic violation. It had become a conversation about the deeper flaws in a system that many people trusted but which, at times, failed them. Before hanging up, Judge Harris made one final offer. "If you're ever in town again, I'd be honored if you would meet with me. I'd like to hear more about your experiences and your thoughts on how we can move forward in a way that fosters trust and fairness in the system. And of course, I'll continue to follow the work you're doing with your blog." Aisha smiled, feeling the weight of the offer. "Thank you, Judge. I'll definitely keep that in mind. I appreciate your willingness to keep this conversation going. It's rare, and it means a lot." As they ended the call, Aisha sat back in her chair, a sense of accomplishment settling over her. This wasn't the end of the story, it was just another chapter. She had started a conversation, and it had ignited something bigger than she had ever anticipated. It wasn't just about a ticket, a fine, or a judge. It was about the realization that change could begin with one conversation, one step at a time. And for the first time in a long while, Aisha felt hopeful about the future. Months passed, and the ripple effects of Aisha's viral blog post continued to grow. What had started as a personal story of a traffic ticket had blossomed into a broader conversation about racial biases, justice, and the humanizing of those who came before the law. The media coverage waned, as it always did, but the dialogue she had started had not. Aisha's inbox was filled with stories of others who had been inspired to speak out, to address their own experiences, and to advocate for change within their communities. She had unwittingly become a symbol of courage, using her voice to highlight issues that many people had long kept silent. Judge Leonard Harris, on the other hand, had taken significant steps in his own professional journey. Aisha occasionally heard updates about his efforts. His participation in seminars on racial equity, his increased involvement in initiatives aimed at diversifying the judiciary, and his commitment to better understanding the lives of those whose cases he handled. The transformation had been slow, but it was real. He had publicly shared his experience of reaching out to Aisha and the lessons he had learned in a speech at a national judicial conference. It wasn't something most judges did, especially publicly admitting to shortcomings, but Judge Harris had done it without hesitation. It had made a powerful impact on many of his colleagues, who, though skeptical at first, began to take a closer look at their own practices and biases. Aisha had been following his journey with a quiet sense of pride. In her blog, she frequently shared her thoughts on the importance of accountability, how people in power could make the greatest change by first admitting their own mistakes and committing to do better. She never expected this kind of response from Judge Harris, but it filled her with hope that true change was possible, even in places where it seemed least likely. The two had stayed in contact sporadically, exchanging emails and messages of encouragement. Though their relationship had started with a clash, it had blossomed into something much more meaningful, a partnership for social change. The conversations between them weren't just about personal apologies, they were about a shared commitment to improving the system, to understanding the stories of the people they served, and to challenging the biases that had so often gone unchecked. One afternoon, Aisha sat down to reflect on how much had changed since that fateful day in court. The traffic fine, once a symbol of frustration and injustice, had opened doors to new opportunities. She had been invited to speak at conferences, to write about her experiences for national publications, and to meet with policymakers to discuss reform. But even more than that, she had come to understand the deeper power of storytelling, the way her words, her vulnerability, could spark the kind of change that numbers and statistics often could not. Aisha looked at the emails in her inbox and the letters of support she had received from her followers. People were telling her that her story had helped them find their own voice. They were using their own platforms to talk about their experiences with the justice system, to demand accountability, and to ask for fairness. It wasn't just her voice being heard. It was the collective voice of everyone who had ever been overlooked, ignored, or dismissed. In her heart, Aisha knew this was only the beginning. She wasn't done yet. The journey she had started with that simple blog post was far from over. She had found her purpose, and with it, a sense of responsibility to continue advocating for those whose voices had yet to be heard. She smiled to herself, knowing that she had done more than just change one person's mind. She had begun to change a system. And with that, Aisha set her sights on the next adventure, ready to continue her work with the same courage and passion that had driven her all along. Because for Aisha Reynolds, the journey had never just been about the places she visited. It had always been about the people she met and the stories they had to tell. And those stories, she believed, had the power to change the world.